It was interesting. 4 years ago when this started, Mike Fried and I had just started to think about putting together real-world data in the United States, I think to try to mirror some of the data that was coming out of France and other countries. And it's really developed into a full-time passion and a belief that this real-world data has value at many levels. And I'll talk about the HCV Target Project, but I'm going to bring in some of the other real-world cohort data, some of which you'll see here at this meeting. So I have some disclosures. Our university gets research support from almost everyone. None of it comes to me directly. So what are the topics I want to cover? First of all, as we know, there are some gaps. They're becoming less and less from the phase 3 trials. I'll mention at least most of the HCV observational cohorts that are in existence, many of which are reporting out here and typically at AASLD and EASL. And then I'll cover some of the efficacy and safety of the Hep C regimens in the real world, and lump in genotype 1 and 4 and 2 and 3 together, and then just touch briefly on data in special populations. So what are the benefits of observational cohorts? I think just simply we learn how these drugs behave in the real world, because as we know, the real world is not the phase 3 clinical trial. Patients are more heterogeneous. Prescribers are much more heterogeneous. Patients aren't carefully screened typically, and treatment is sometimes not even monitored or certainly minimally monitored. So I think most importantly, we broaden our knowledge and our confidence in the risk-benefit ratio of the drugs. And I'll show you some examples of that throughout this talk. And kind of a nice quote, trials are short, real life has no time limit. So we need long-term cohorts to understand some of the things that Heiner talked about earlier. If you cure someone with Hep C, when and how long does it take their cancer risk to drop and go away? When can we stop screening? Are there bad things that may actually happen that he highlighted? So it's these types of cohorts that will help the world answer long-term questions related to outcome data. So this is a very interesting slide that Jody Siegel from Hopkins put together recently for us for a grant submission we were doing. And this is what's called a systematic review of the majority of the trials that we use to make our decisions. I don't have a pointer, but yes, I do. I just want to highlight that each of these studies that you see here are studies that led to the major all oral drugs developed in the US and Western Europe. And what you see are point estimates of where the SVR is in dark, and then the long lines are what are called the confidence intervals. And what you can see is that some studies we have a lot of confidence in. Some of the ION studies, Pearl 4, really tight confidence intervals. So if, when you see an SVR of 97%, there's a pretty good chance that your patient's going to have an SVR of, say, 93 to 100%. But you can also see we're treating populations that have confidence intervals over 20%, which means your patient could have a 20% lower or 20% higher response rate. So one of the opportunities of real-world data is to narrow confidence intervals, which means to improve our confidence in individual patient subsets and how they respond to certain drugs. Because large phase 4 studies aren't really done anymore long-term to narrow these confidence intervals, but the real world will use these drugs in large numbers, and so the reduction in confidence intervals and the improvement in the precision of safety and efficacy signals, I think, is the major benefit of observational cohorts. So there are a number of cohorts. I know I left out many, but I just mentioned a few. In the US, there's HCV Target, which has been US plus Western Europe. TRIO, which NID is here and represents. There's the European Multicentric Compassionate Use Program that you'll see some data on. The French have been really the masters at this and have a number of cohort studies underway. I show 2 here. The UK has a very big active group. And a number of countries where this disease is particularly in a high prevalence and have unique opportunities to add valuable data. and a good example for that is the Egyptian real-world cohort that you'll see in the afternoon session here. So this is just a little bit of a reflection of how you can make interesting conclusions over time. This looks at the beginning of the very first all-oral therapy approval when sofosbuvir was approved back in December of 2013. And you can see almost immediately, even though sofosbuvir ribavirin probably wasn't the best option, almost immediately people started to choose all-oral regimens. And you can see about 20% of patients still were receiving pegylated interferon. Once sofosbuvir, decladisvir, or Harvoni got approved, at least in our data set of about, around this data set, around 3,500 patients, not a single patient received interferon. So it's very clear. And then as we get into even the newer drugs, with Viekira and decladisvir, again, you continue to see the two observations. One is there's a clear market leader, at least in the United States and Western Europe. But the more important, I think, observation is that patients and docs are almost always choosing an oral therapy. Even though I think the guidelines have pushed back now on certain populations, genotype 3 cirrhotics, it's interesting at least to see that that is not being preferred by patients and physicians, at least in some of these databases. So I want to start with some data. And typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take data sets and compare it to phase 3 trials and just see how well real-world data reflects with the phase 3 trials. When there's very close concordance, I think we feel more comfortable in the conclusions of those trials and using those drugs in those populations. When there's discordance, I think that requires more study or anxiety about the performance of that regimen. And we'll cover most of the regimens being used for genotype 1, at least in the US and Western Europe. So I wanted to show a little bit of data on soft-peg-riba because it still is in use, and there's some abstracts here at this meeting. HCV target data is in blue, and the neutrino trial, which was a Gilead trial, is in red. And these analyses actually, you just break out similar sets of patients in both data set and look at SVR. And here what you'll see are overall that HCV target, this is real-world data in the US and Western Europe, tracked almost dead on, and in fact, numerically a little bit better than the neutrino study. So back in the early 2013 days, actually these results suggest overall somewhere around a 90% cure rate. Despite that, this regimen has now left most of the market in the US. So this data is new data because neutrino looked at just patients with hep C naive, never treated. And there really is no good data set in the treatment experienced population. So as physicians and patients, we actually use those regimens, and so we can generate a similar type 3 data, a phase 3 data with at least here a decent number of patients for the amount that are being treated. And what you'll see on the right side of the slide is that in the treatment experienced population, soft-peg-riba for 12 weeks is a reasonable choice at 86% SVR, but in the presence of cirrhosis and treatment experience, it really does not perform very well. And I think it's a story that tells itself over and over again. I mean, these are treatment experience, so it's failed interferon, and you're adding that interferon into this regimen, and the addition of cirrhosis and probably poor treatment response factors add up. So anyway, you can generate new data in observational registries that are not done in clinical trials, but are done in the real world. And here's data that Dr. Esmat's going to present later on today. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I think it's interesting how close the comparisons are between the Egyptian real-world data for genotype 4 and the HCV target genotype 1 data. So what you'll see here in a huge population, almost 550 genotype 4 patients treated with soft-peg-riba for 12 weeks, overall cure rate's about 85%. But this about 10% difference in response rate based on prior treatment experience. And then my guess is we're going to hear this afternoon that older cirrhotics did much worse in the treatment experience group. So anyway, again, real-world data sets where we don't have a big clinical trial. Gilead had a few genotype, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6s in there. But to really get confidence in how to use this drug, this is the kind of study. I didn't put the confidence intervals because I don't have them, but with this many patients, there's going to be pretty good confidence in this data. So this is the type of data we love to see. That obviously PEG isn't used very much, at least in Western Europe and the US, but it's a type of study and type of data that's very valuable. So moving on to sofosbuvir and simepravir for 12 weeks. I took the 2 phase 3 trials, Optimus 1 and 2, and broke down the different subsets of patients, and then compared that to a much bigger data set that came out of HCV Target, where we had close to 1,000 patients overall, and in this data analysis, a little over 700 get simepravir plus sofosbuvir. What you'll see is, regardless of naive or treatment experienced, the presence or absence of cirrhosis, in general, the regimen's actually held up pretty close, within 4 to 5% of the overall targeted SVR. So we would look at this, I think, in general as a potential validation that, yeah, this regimen looks fairly close to what happened in phase 3. Actually, this is a very interesting story because the data was generated in the real world way in advance of actually the phase 3 trials occurring. Again, I think this is a drug that this is a combination that probably got endorsed with a label change because of real-world data, and a phase 3 trial being put in place just to confirm the real-world data experience. So, very interesting story for this. So with a huge data set of, at least here, 715, you can see that we can get very precise with very small confidence intervals. So overall, sofosbuvir and simepravir works at about 88% of the time. You can see the impact of cirrhosis, 85 versus 93%. You can look at the difference in subtype. 1As do worse due to simepravir. Treatment experienced has minimal impact. And here's the triple failures that Heiner talked about earlier. These are people who had failed a protease inhibitor with boceprevir or telaprevir who got retreated. Overall, we would have thought they would have been miserable low levels of cure rates, but 78% versus those that had not been treated with a previous PI, who were at 90%. Treatment failure just to interferon had no impact on the regimen. And then the last part of the slide, you can see you can break down. Clearly, genotype 1A cirrhotics have the lowest cure rate, and genotype 1B non-cirrhotics have the highest cure rate. So as you develop big data sets, you develop a fair amount of confidence around talking to patients with an SVR in mind, I think, based on larger data sets. Another thing that we were able to do around simepravir sofosbuvir is that it was never tested in a phase 3 study whether or not ribavirin made a difference. Remember in Cosmos there was a ribavirin arm and it was unclear and it was such a small study no one really knew. The phase 3 studies were done without ribavirin. So what happened in the world is a bunch of clinicians said, we think ribavirin should be used, and they used it. And a number of other clinicians said, we don't think it should be used, and didn't. And so again, you end up with the ability to compare almost 1,000 patients between did they get ribavirin or not, and you can do some fairly sophisticated adjusted analyses. And although it's not a head-to-head randomized controlled trial, across every group, when you look at balanced groups with and without ribavirin, this study clearly suggests that ribavirin did not add anything to at least a 12-week treatment regimen for simepravir sofosbuvir. So again, it can allow you to look at new questions that are being, regimens that are being developed in the community, and the statisticians can help us interpret whether or not they're reliable or justified. So we don't think, based on the largest data set in the world, that ribavirin should be used with simepravir and sofosbuvir. So moving on, decladisvir sofosbuvir. This is another abstract that I believe is being presented at this meeting for genotype 1. In the U.S., decladisvir is only approved for G3, and while in Europe and elsewhere, it's a broadened label. And here's 24 weeks now of genotype 1 treatment with declatosphere sofosbuvir with or without ribavirin. And what you'll see in blue is without ribavirin, in red with ribavirin, and then overall. Small numbers, but this is starting to accumulate. And clearly, the very early 10,000-foot view is that 24 weeks of declatosphere sofosbuvir in the real world looks like a heck of a good treatment outcome in genotype 1 patients. And 1A and 1B don't really appear to have an early differentiator, but obviously time and more numbers will tell the final story. And then I think one of the most interesting and important questions financially for the world right now is how is sofosbuvir, ladipasvir, or Harvoni doing with their short-term therapy? At the time that we were in Berlin and presented this data, we had about 227 patients who had been in a cohort that got either 8 or 12 weeks. And what you can see is that the 8-week group did just as well as the 12-week group. And suggesting that that is a reasonable thing to do. These were patients who were intended to get 8 weeks. And these analyses are going to be very challenging, so we're going to have to be very careful how people interpret their data. Just because somebody got 8 weeks didn't mean it was intended up front. Because they could have not filled their last prescription, they could have had a side effect, they could have gotten an automobile accident. So anyway, there's some terminology issues that we're going to have to solve as we look at these data sets. But the other really important thing is that only a third of patients who qualify to get short-term therapy, remember in the FDA label, at least for the US, non-cirrhotic naive patients with a viral load less than 6 million can be considered to receive 8 weeks of therapy. And so what this shows is, and I think by ASLD there'll be enough real-world data to say this is very reliable. We're spending a lot of extra money that we may not if that data holds true. If the data doesn't, then we would need to push back on the payers and say, let us go longer. So anyway, here's a great example where I think the real-world data will both show how often an algorithm, an FDA label is followed, but then also help guide physicians to feel comfortable if that's correct or not. So there are a number of data cohorts reporting out. There are probably others that I've left off. So if you look at just the 8-week regimen data, you have the Gilead phase 3 studies that showed 97%. A medium-sized German cohort reported out. I don't know if it's going to be updated at this meeting. At 100%, and then I showed you the HCV target. So it's also nice to start seeing other data sets from different parts of the world, and as you see them come together, I think, again, it gives more and more confidence that this 8-week regimen may be appropriate. And if it is the right decision, we probably need to develop education opportunities to convince physicians and patients to take those 8-week regimens, because, again, we'll save billions of dollars worldwide. Okay, so I'm going to move now into genotype 2 and 3. And genotype 2 and 3 is a simpler story, but becomes a little more complicated around genotype 3. So let's start with sofosbuvir ribavirin. So this is the HCV target data where we have a pretty big genotype 2 population in both an intent to treat and a per protocol analysis, and comparing it to the Valence phase 3 study. And again, what you see, and the per protocol analysis is probably most appropriate for these types of comparisons. What you see for genotype 2, sof-riba basically almost is exactly the same as a phase 3 trial. Genotype 3, though, even though they're smaller numbers, there's always been a signal, at least in our database as well as many others, that it doesn't look like Valence, and there's lots of reasons why. And I think if you just jump right into it, the reason is cirrhotics don't do as well. And so here I have a little different analysis, and blue is the target data set, but here now we're looking at both Valence and then the follow-up Bassan study, and trying to understand why these studies are different. But what clearly looks is that again, they're all smallish numbers. Again, that's why eventually we're going to have to combine lots of these real-world data sets. But they're fairly comparable numbers. At least our data set from HCV target does not look like either Valence or Bassan. And it may be a difference of US versus Europe, could be a difference of more advanced cirrhotics, but it looks like clearly, again, in our mind, the treatment experience genotype 3 cirrhotic is still an unmet need for the real world, at least for the soft ribo regimen. And I think most people would agree. So there are other regimens that are now being considered. We're going to see some new data at AASLD from a new regimen. But at least now in the US, and it's been in Europe, declitosphere sofosbuvir, with or without ribavirin. And this is data from the French cohort study for compassionate use. And again, some nice data looking, again, Ally 3, that study, or Ally 1, the study that I was an author on, Ally 1, I think, where it just looked at 12 weeks of declitosphere sofosbuvir, did not look at duration, and it did not look at ribavirin. So those are studies that, boy, we would have liked to have seen to try to interpret those results of a very poor response in cirrhotics. But now, instead of redesigning phase 3 trials, which they're going to do anyways, the real world will tell us, because docs are going to do it. And again, here's where I think real world data can much more quickly answer those questions instead of waiting 2 years for a phase 2 study to report out. And here's data that's just looking at 12 versus 24 weeks, and I think a very clear signal that using declitosphere sofosbuvir appears to benefit cirrhotic patients by extending from 12 to 24 weeks. And an SVR here of 88%. 76 is still a little bit higher than what was seen in the phase 3 study. But again, the ability to get quick data from real world because it's going to be done. So I'm going to end by just referencing a number of special populations. Again, these real world databases have covered many different areas. Here is a really nice data set from the UK looking at NUCs plus NS5A inhibitors with or without ribavirin, and starting to look at decompensated cirrhotics. You saw an earlier talk that looked at the benefits of an SVR. And here on the left with red, you have soft ledipasvir plus ribavirin. In green, the same regimen without it. In blue now, switching to soft declitosphere with ribavirin, and then the darkest blue without ribavirin. And what I'll comment on is first is that overall decompensated cirrhotics do not have the same SVR that non-decompensated cirrhotics do. They're fantastic. We would have never dreamed that we would see SVR rates this high, but most of these regimens in a compensated cirrhotic are going to deliver mid-90s. So I think the real world is saying there's something different about decompensated disease. It's likely, as some of the data that NID and others have shown, it's likely related to stage of decompensation. A's and B's probably look good, C's probably don't, but there's a lot of work to be done, as Ira talked about earlier, who is too far to actually gain benefit. And then also you can see the regimens of a NUC plus NS5A probably don't make a big difference in terms of genotype 1, although it looks like clearly the addition of ribavirin with declitosphere soft is beneficial. And then you'll also see that genotype 3 still doesn't have great response rates. But again, here, declitosphere appears to be a better NS5A inhibitor than ledipasvir for the 3s. Again, with the caveats of actually small but big numbers for G3 patients. So transplantation, we're going to hear some more data today on transplantation. Most of these special populations, I think we can all conclude, are luckily not so special anymore. Every single one of them has been found to respond, and co-infection is probably the best example. Liver transplant is probably the second best example. Here is real-world data of declitosphere sofosbuvir in pretty nice numbers, with or without ribavirin, across treatment-naive, genotype 1, and a few 3, 4, and 5s. And suggesting that the impact of cirrhosis is minimalized in this population with this regimen. So here's some really nice data. Obviously, what has to go along with this data is issues around immunosuppression changes, rejection rates, et cetera. But in general, the real-world data has shown that transplant patients can be fairly easily cured with many of the all-oral regimens. Bob Brown last year also showed the target data set, which looked at sofosbuvir, simefovir with or without ribavirin. And again, overall, 90% cure rates. And you can see some impact on mainly treatment genotype, subtype 1A, cirrhosis. And here, there was a signal that MELDs greater than 10 performed worse than MELDs less than 10. And there's probably a much higher inflection point as you get into MELDs above 16. But again, very quick transplant data gets duplicated from all the phase 3 data, usually even before the phase 3 transplant studies are published. And then I'm going to end just with the last unmet need is the renal failure population. We will have potentially 2 regimens. There's not final data yet on the AbbVie regimen yet about how that works in a broad population of renal failure patients. Merck has been given an expedited approval process for its really high SVR rates for patients on hemodialysis or stage 4 or 5 kidney disease. So I think those regimens are coming that we'll be able to use. But in the meantime, again, real life just seems to want to do it, right? A bunch of us have in our clinics people with renal failure who have bad liver disease, and they say, I can't wait a couple of years, and let's go. So a lot of people get treated against label recommendations, at least in the US. The FDA says they can't give any recommendations, and it's probably patients should not be treated because of unknown safety issues around sofosbuvir's metabolite. But what you can see is that 17 patients were treated on dialysis. And then we were able to do a comparison, again, very small numbers, across the impact of GFR using soft-based regimens. And at least from an efficacy standpoint, people who got normally dosed with sofosbuvir in a very small number had just as high a cure rate as anyone else. Those patients have lots of adverse events, and it's unclear if those adverse events are related to the treatment or just related to the population. In the Merck phase 3 study, where they had a lead-in placebo arm, it's clear that that population has significant comorbidities. But anyway, this is, I think, more showing it as an example that these real-world databases develop data on things that would never be done or allowed, probably by an IRB and or a clinical trial, because it was clear that Gilead was not moving forward with any clinical trials. And again, the real world will generate that kind of data because patients and docs are very industrious. So the last thing is, I haven't mentioned anything about safety, and there's too much to summarize, but I'll just take one quick look at this database, which is starting to mature now. And I just want to highlight on the orange, other than the soft aclatosphere group that has a little bit higher AE event, and that's mainly because of an early access program that's feeding into some of that data, almost all these adverse event discontinuation rates are around 1% to 2%. And that's just what the clinical trials showed. And I want to remind you at the bottom of the slide, the same data from the telaprevir, boceprevir days was the early DC rates due to adverse events was about 10%. So clearly, these drugs are fairly safe in the real world and being applied with a nice profile. So in summary, I think the real world data is generally, so far, very consistent with the phase 2-3 trial data. This is very different. I probably should have shown you a summary slide from telaprevir, boceprevir days and the correlation with real world. There was a massive difference across safety and efficacy for many of the regimens. So that's why we were so surprised when all these cohorts start reporting out numbers that are so close to clinical trial data. It's reassuring. But I think we also know we still have some work to do. Genotype 3 clearly remains the unmet need, especially that treatment-experienced cirrhotic. Real world confirms most patients are going to get cured. This area of decompensated cirrhosis shows up in almost all real-world databases. They can be cured, but when is it too late? And what happens long-term to them is something that's perfect for the observational registries. The early Harvoni data does suggest, and I think it'll get confirmed one way or the other by AASLD, is the 8-week regimen appropriate in the way it was defined? And if so, I think we should embrace it and save a lot of money. And then I think the safety story has so far been very reassuring, very low rates of discontinuation, and very different than those with PEG. I will say that these databases did pull out. It was because of these databases and their event reporting that things like the amiodarone-sofosbuvir interaction came out. And again, there's a lot of safety benefit that regimens that shouldn't be used together can be identified as you start to put together tens of thousands of patients across these registries and with the FDA. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I think we're going to have questions later, right? Or now. Thanks.
Yeah. Many thanks, David. I think perhaps a few questions just
Sure.
for clarification, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
I would be very interested in further understanding this question of those in the registry with the 8 versus 12 weeks treatment duration. You mentioned that only 35% were eligible, or of those who were eligible, only 35% of physicians decided to go shorter. So if you
it's
take
the
the whole
latter.
population, how many would be eligible,
Yes.
and how many physicians are confident already in
Yes.
using it?
So it's the latter. So out of 100 patients who would have been eligible, who were naive, didn't have a diagnosis of cirrhosis, and had a viral load less than 6 million, only 35 of those were put on the 8-week regimen, intended. So what happened is that people saw, I think, I saw that data, I saw the FDA analysis of the data, and I said, there's not enough numbers, and I don't believe it. And I think there's a group of maybe F3s that are going to need to go longer, and if the payers will pay for 12 weeks, that's what's best for my patient. So I think there are a lot of people like me who had that thought that I'm not going to let my patient be the guinea pig to prove this, and so that's why for me, seeing this data, especially as it gets a little bit more significant in terms of numbers, I would change my practice. The payers, when they see this, it won't matter. They'll change the practice anyways.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it's like in Europe. If the German cohorts looked at percent eligible versus percent who get it, but I bet it's something similar, unless the payers control it.
Ira, you have also a question?
David, thanks very much for that great talk. One of the areas of greatest impact of these kinds of registry or real-world databases is with regard to the question of whether we can use data from those databases to argue with recalcitrant payers who may insist, for example, on adhering to what's in the label. So to me, the most obvious example in the US right now is decladazvir and sofosbuvir, 24 weeks with or without ribavirin for genotype 3 cirrhotics, which I think most of us think is better based on all these real-world data, including yours and the European databases, but not in the label. What information do you have about whether clinicians, at least in the US, have been able to use those data to break those barriers down?
So so payers look at guidelines. We've spent the last 2 years in the middle of this discussion for other reasons, but payers look at guidelines. They don't really look at data. So if ASLD and ESL embrace G3 soft decladazvir, that's usually, I think, top priority number one. The other thing is that the FDA can use this data if they feel it's strong enough to broaden a label. So it's what happened with cimeprevir. Cimeprevir's label got broadened to be included as an antiviral agent with sofosbuvir without ever a phase 3 study having been done, based on such massive amount of real-world data kind of supporting the efficacy for an unmet need. But I don't think, at least in our experience, especially in the US, where it's not even approved for G3, or it's not even approved for G1. For G3, we're being allowed to use it. But I'll tell you, the payers, because we were just talking to Mike Fried about this, the last G3 prescription I put in for 6 months of sofosbuvir decladazvir, the payer came back and said they said, we'll fill this, but if you choose one of these 2 other options that were much cheaper, we will give your patient discounts throughout their treatment.